Greetings, friends, and welcome to Cooking with Debbie. So typically in preparation for Weekend of Spirit, I would gather a group of chefs and we would meet in the Susan Dickerman kitchen and we would make soup for 80 to 100 servings, which means that each of the recipes we would use, we would multiply by 8 or something ridiculous. Usually there'd be 3 or 4 of us and we'd chop and chop and chop and chop and then wait and wait and wait while the soup cooked and end up with gigantic things. The hardest thing about the whole process was finding a place to store the big bowls of soup before we could heat them up for the next day. So this year, the kitchen is closed. We will not have our meal together, but we will be together via Zoom as we share our meal for Weekend of Spirit. So we thought we would do a little cooking demonstration, although these are very easy soups to make, but we thought you would enjoy the fun of making it together. So I've done some of the chopping and stuff in advance, so if you're starting this from scratch, you might find you need to pause this to catch up with chopping the onions or whatever. So feel free to pause it. Feel free to do things differently than what I suggest, but I hope it will help you feel a sense of connection as we share our retreat meal from different kitchens and different dining rooms, but also knowing that we are connected in spirit. So this first soup that I'm going to make is our ginger lentil soup, and it's one that we've been having for years and years with Open Spirit. I think since Bettina first made multiple batches of it for one of our early Weekend of Spirits. So thank you, Bettina. I'm going to start by turning on my stove top. This already has 4 cups of water in it, and I'm going to symbolically pour 2 more cups of water into this, and then a cup of lentils, which I have rinsed off for reasons of making it a much more enjoyable experience for everyone to have lentil soup. So I'm pouring those in. So when we start cooking this, all we're doing is cooking lentils and water. And unlike a lot of lentil soups that I've made, for this one, I think the recipe calls for you to leave the pot open. So I typically would put the top on to keep the steam in there, but that's not the way this one works. I am going to cover it while it heats up so that it'll come to a boil faster. And meanwhile, while that's cooking is when we saute the vegetables and the spices together, which then get poured into the lentil mix. So I have my sauteing pan, and I'm going to turn that on to medium-high, and add a little bit of olive oil. I think it calls for 2 teaspoons. I think I have more than that. And we'll let that heat up. And this is where I have already chopped onion, celery and carrot, ginger, and garlic. So if you're following along in the recipe, it calls for 1.5 tablespoons of chopped ginger. I like to do a little more ginger, and it calls for, I think, 4 cloves of garlic, and I tend to do a little less garlic, but whatever you like. So as the oil heats up, then I will pour in my onion, and my carrot and celery. And interestingly, one of the things it says is to cover this as it sautés, even though you keep sort of working with it a little bit. Of course, I don't have a top that quite fits that, so I will be making do with cookie sheet on top. So the idea, I think, is to really let, as you put the spices in, to really let those sort of get integrated together. So while we're watching that, I will tell you that the other soup that I will make some other night on a separate video is a carrot soup that also is a vegan soup. So it's a cream soup, but the cream is just the carrots and celery and onion sauteed together, and it also has apple in it, and that gives it a little bit of the sweetness or tartness of the apple. It's good to use one of the more tart apples, so a Granny Smith or something like that. So hopefully there'll be another video that will show that. But in the meantime, these are heating up. So a little history of the Weekend of Spirit. When it started, I think we actually got soup from Panera, and that was lovely. And then the next year we decided, well, there's a bunch of us that like to cook soup, so we would do that. And Don Aiken, who owned a restaurant in Boston, donated for many years a carrot ginger soup. So we would make the lentil soup, and he would bring carrot ginger soup from Medieval Manor, and that was a real treat. That was a tremendously good soup. So sometimes when I make this carrot soup in his honor, or in his memory, as Don has since passed away, I add a little ginger to it as well. So we've typically had a volunteer group that has made the soups, and then that day we've had crock pots and crock pots upon crock pots of soup. Sometimes we've gotten bread donated by Panera. We've often had fruit donated by Trader Joe's. They've been very generous. And sometimes we've had, last couple of years we made cornbread. So if you want to be really true to the open spirit and you're making these soups, you might also consider making yourself some cornbread. I hope that you are excited about the upcoming Weekend of Spirit. I am very excited about all of the new things that we're able to do in spite of the fact that we're not able to gather together. Like the fact that our Friday night program is presented by Samala and Patrick St. Pierre, who are now living in San Diego. And we were so grieving when they moved away because they've been such an integral part of Open Spirit. And so excited that one of the blessings of this complicated, difficult time is that it makes perfect sense to have people from San Diego participating in our Weekend of Spirit. So they will be doing the Friday night virtual art show, and I cannot wait to see the work that they have been doing in the last 2 years. So you want to saute this until the onion begins to get a little bit transparent. One thing I never like in my soup is undercooked onion. So we let it saute for a couple more minutes. Try not to spill too much onion on the stove top. So that is now boiling, which means I will take the top off so that it goes. So I'm going to turn down the heat on the lentils so they are just sauteing, not sauteing, simmering. Thank you. You can tell I have never done a cook-along with Debbie before. So we want the lentils to be simmering and the vegetables to be sauteing. The other thing that I'm really excited about in terms of Weekend of Spirit is our opening presentation, our keynote speaker on Saturday morning, which is Dr. Lascelles Fitzpatrick. So we've had Dr. Fitzpatrick come to a couple of different Open Spirit things, particularly things sponsored by the Multi-Faith Collaborative. She is a visiting professor at Wellesley College, and her specialty is African cosmology. The first time she came was as part of our World Interfaith Harmony Week celebration, and she was part of a panel talking about the ways we understand interfaith harmony. It was way back in January, back when we would gather in person and have a meal together. Dr. Fitzpatrick was just, I was so entranced by the way she talked about the centrality of balance in African cosmology, and that healing was really about restoration of balance. So I'm going to pause for a minute because I think this is probably ready for, yeah. So now I'm going to add the ginger and the garlic. Mix that in. So the ginger is actually, it says to chop it, and I think you could also grate it if that's easier for you. I think it is worth using fresh ginger one way or another. The garlic, it also says chopped, and again, you could press it or chop it. And then I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of cumin. I tend to be a little generous with the spices because this is not a hot and spicy. And a teaspoon of coriander. I think one year there was someone who was allergic to coriander and we left it out, and it was also still a very tasty soup. So a teaspoon of coriander. Now later in the recipe you'll notice that it calls for a little bit of Tabasco sauce, and I have never had Tabasco sauce in since I've been making this. So I do just a little dash of cayenne pepper just to add a little bit of interest to it. So you mix those all in. And it starts to smell really good, especially the ginger. And then you cover it up and let those spices sink in for a minute or so. So anyway, about Dr. Fitzpatrick. Dr. Fitzpatrick came back as one of the presenters when the Multi-Faith Collaborative began offering some programs this spring virtually, and they were reflecting on where we find a sense of hope and meaning, and what is it that helps us get through this time of the pandemic. So this was back in March and April and May when we were struggling to just make sense of what was going on. And Dr. Fitzpatrick was one of the first presenters that we had, and I think we had 50 people there, and they came from all over the world. Clearly folks who knew her and wanted to hear her speak, and again, I was entranced. So this time, when I called her up to invite her to be part of this Weekend of Spirit, or I emailed her, and then we talked on the phone, she was so excited as we talked about this understanding of how we transform our lives, and that process of release, of letting go of our expectations from the past, evolving and adapting, changing, learning to live in a new way, and ultimately creating. And she was really taken by that by the theme. And she talked about, we came up with Earth is our sanctuary. And recognizing that what's going on with the pandemic is related to our understanding of how we care for the environment, how we care for the earth. And we talked a lot about sort of the dual pandemics that we're experiencing of COVID-19 and racial injustice, and how both of them have to do with not being able to breathe. Folks who are sick with COVID-19, those of us wearing masks and struggling to breathe through our masks, and those who have experienced the violence of choking and not being able to breathe. So making our planet breathable. We started with the word again and realized, no, part of what we're realizing is that for many people in the world, the planet has not been breathable for a long time. So making our planet breathable. So I'm very excited to hear that, and I hope you will be too. So now you can't smell it, but it smells really, really good. And it's ready to go into the lentils. It actually says to let the lentils cook for 20 minutes before I do this. It might not have been 20 minutes, but it's soup, so you can kind of do whatever you want. So I'll bring that back up to a boil. It also calls for a can of whole tomatoes chopped, so I've cheated with a can of diced tomatoes. And I think you can do whichever you want in terms of whether you want to strain those first and not include the tomato juice. I like the tomato juice, so I include the whole can. This particular one is no salt added, but I don't think it matters so much because this calls for a couple of teaspoons of salt, and I generally don't add the salt and let people add the salt as they would like. So we'll let this come to a boil, and then we'll bring it down to a simmer. And then at that point, we're simply going to let it cook for 30 minutes. So I don't think that I can riff for 30 minutes while my soup cooks, so I'm going to invite you to trust me that it will cook, just as yours will, and I hope. And when you're done, if you like, you can sprinkle a little parsley on top. So I hope you will enjoy making the soup, and I hope you will enjoy Weekend of Spirit, and that this experience of cooking together will help you have a sense of feeling connected with a community that cares about you and that is deeply rooted in our caring for one another. So be well, enjoy making soup, enjoy eating soup, and come to Weekend of Spirit and celebrate the ways that we are transforming and being transformed in this time as we release, evolve, and create. Thanks.